Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Notebook LMvideos.com overview show. All right, for this explainer, we're doing something a little different. We're going to survey 7 totally separate sources. We're jumping from economics and daily news all the way to theology, science, and even some pretty wild theories about global power. So let's dive in and see what they've got for us.
Okay, so here's the plan. We're going to cover China's economy, take a quick snapshot of global news, look at a theological argument about Jesus and Judaism, then explore visions of the afterlife. After that, it's a look at the so-called war on reality, the secrets of the appendix, and we'll wrap up with a theory on a web of global control. Let's get started.
All right, first up, we're looking at an article from the UNS Review, and the whole idea here is that China's economic model is at a crossroads, and it should be looking very, very closely at America's history, specifically the rise and fall of its middle class, to avoid, repeating the same mistakes. So the source breaks it down into 2 competing systems. On one hand, you have what it calls Wall Street capitalism. The argument here is that this system is pretty much impossible to reform because it just keeps getting more predatory and corrupt. On the other hand, you have socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the key difference, according to this article, is that the state, the government, is the one in charge of corporations and banks, not the other way around. This supposedly gives it the power to adapt and evolve in a positive way.
And here's that cautionary tale in a nutshell. The author lays out this timeline for the American middle class. It starts with this middle-class miracle right after World War II, when the U.S. was the world's factory floor. But then, around 1965, things start to change. The Vietnam War debt, new legislation, and by 1980, with trickle-down economics, the source says an unregulated oligarchy took over. The end result? Outsourcing and a massive wealth transfer that led to its decline. The message is pretty clear. China, watch out.
Okay, switching gears completely, let's jump to our second source, which is a daily news service. This is just a quick, rapid-fire look at some key headlines from August 19th, 2025, to get a feel for what's happening.
So on the economic front, it's kind of interesting. In China, things are looking up. The Shanghai Composite hits a 10-year high, the market cap for A shares crosses 100 trillion yen, and a whopping 65 million people flew in July. But at the same time, you've got OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, waving a red flag, worried about a potential investment bubble in AI. So, a bit of a mixed bag. And check this out. Culturally, China's domestic film industry is absolutely crushing it. The summer box office hits were huge. Dead to Rights pulled in 2.6 billion yuan, Nobody Hit a Billion, and The Lychee Road brought in 670 million. This just shows how strong that local market is. All right, let's move into our third source. This one is from LewRockwell.com, and it's a theological argument. The author here is making a case for what they see as a deep, fundamental split between Jesus and the modern definition of a faithful Jew. And this quote really gets to the heart of it. The article's main point is this: the very things that make Jesus the central figure of Christianity, his words, his deeds, his claims about who he was, are the exact same things that, according to this author, set him completely apart from, and even at odds with, Judaism as it's typically understood today. Okay, now for our fourth source. This one explores the idea of the afterlife, and it does so by looking at 2 things: biblical accounts and, interestingly, stories from people on their deathbeds. The paper brings up the story of Lazarus and the rich man from the Bible, and the key takeaway here is this phrase: a great gulf fixed. The idea presented is that once someone dies, there's this massive, uncrossable chasm between heaven and hell. It's final. There's no going back and forth, no changing your mind. And this is where it gets into the anecdotal evidence. The source pulls together stories from nurses and hospice workers who say they've seen 2 very different kinds of transitions. For those they describe as saved, the experience is often peaceful. They report seeing Jesus or loved ones. But for those described as unsaved, the accounts are, terrifying. People fighting death, talking about seeing fire or demons. A really stark contrast. Now we're circling back to LewRockwell.com for our 5th source. And this one makes a pretty bold claim: that government institutions have been deliberately waging information warfare on their own people, and that's why trust has just completely cratered. To set the stage, the article uses this really startling quote, which it attributes to former CIA Director William Casey back in 1981. "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." Whoa. That really frames the whole argument, that this has been a long-term, deliberate plan to shape what people believe. So what are these psychological weapons?
Well, the source lists a few big examples. Things like the Russia collusion narrative and what it calls unbridled COVID hysteria. The argument is that these, along with mass propaganda and censorship, were campaigns that shattered public trust in both the government and the media. All right, let's take a deep breath and switch to something completely different. Our sixth source is from a science podcast, and it's about that little organ we've all been told is useless, the appendix. Turns out, we might have been totally wrong about it.
Yeah, so forget what you learned in biology class. This new research totally changes the game. Instead of being just some vestigial leftover, the appendix is now thought of as a safe house for all the good bacteria in your gut. It's like a backup drive. So if you get really sick and your system gets wiped out, the appendix is there to reboot your microbiome with the good stuff. How cool is that?
And this leads to something called the hygiene hypothesis. The idea is, are we just too clean? Our super sanitized world means our immune systems don't get the training they used to. They're not exposed to as much stuff, and so they can get bored and overreact, which might be a reason we see so many allergies, autoimmune conditions, and, yep, even appendicitis. And for our seventh and final source, we're diving into a Substack newsletter that outlines a pretty complex theory. It's all about a hidden web of control, arguing that global events aren't random, but are actually being manipulated by a network of powerful families and secret societies. So who is supposedly in this network? Well, the source lists some familiar names: the Rothschilds, the Freemasons, the Knights Templar, the Council on Foreign Relations, along with others, like the Satanic 13 Bloodlines. The claim is that these groups form a kind of shadow government, pulling the strings behind the world's political leaders.
The article then tries to connect some dots, specifically with Donald Trump. It claims that back in the 90s, his casinos were bailed out by Rothschild Inc. It also points to his mother's family line, which it says connects him to the Scottish clan MacLeod, a group described as guardians of old Knights Templar locations. So it's trying to link him through both money and bloodline.
And this quote really sums up the entire theory. It flips the script on who's in charge. The argument is, rather than the state in charge of the banks, the Rothschild banks, are now in charge of the state. So the ultimate power, according to this source, doesn't lie with elected governments, but with these massive financial institutions.
Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Video Overview Show, produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com.